So she goes home and she says to her honey, she says, I got saved. I'm going to follow the Lord. And the first thing he does is he'll say, well, that's good for you, but don't push it down my throat. I'm really not interested. Then he gets a bit upset. And then sometimes he'll say things like, well, you can go to that church if you want to. That's up to you. I'm not going to tell you not to. But my kids are going to go to my church. And the woman will say to the husband, but you haven't gone to your church since we got married. And he'll say, yeah, but it's still my church. And so I want my kids with me, so I don't want you taking our kids to that place. I've had that happen here in this fellowship. And the woman doesn't know what to do. Now she comes to church, and as she comes to church, she hears messages where I, as a pastor, will say, be open with your faith and share them. Share your faith with those whom you love and all. And so that's her husband. But what happens when the husband doesn't want to hear? What can be done? Well, he says that they may, without a word, be won by the conduct of their wives. Remember with me that husbands have the authority God has placed in the home, but wives have incredible influence. A wife influences her husband in tremendous ways. My wife, Marie, is the greatest human influence in my life. There's no doubt about that. None whatsoever. And my kids will laugh about that. They'll say, Papa, they'll say, Mama is so spoiled, and I find a joy in that. Yeah, she is, and I want her to be. I want her to be spoiled because she's influenced me so much that I just want to be a blessing to her. So and I'm spoiled by her. I'm spoiled by her, and it's just fine that way. I love it that way. My wife has tremendous influence in my life. She doesn't have authority. God has the authority. But she definitely can move me one way or another depending on her whims and fancies. And so she has to be a woman of God, because I can make some bad choices just based on the fact that I want her to be happy. And so he's speaking concerning the influence by the conduct of the wife. Now, by not preaching to the husband, but living for Jesus Christ, he's saying they may be won over to the Lord. Without a word, the husband may be won to Jesus Christ. How's that going to happen? He says, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Husbands observe. That word observe speaks of intense scrutiny. It talks about a concentration. Husbands can see. We see what we want to see when we want to see. And we do study our wives. There's no doubt about that. And the longer you're married to a woman, the longer you get to know her just by the things she does. You get to know her habits. And if you're one of those husbands like I am, I've made my wife one of my chief areas of study in my life. I watch my wife and I pick up things, the way that she responds. Like I can start predicting sometimes, not always, but I can predict how she'll react to this and how she'll like that. And I'm not always right. She changes her mind. She makes her decisions. She grows and all. But I can pick up a general trait. I can pick up a general trend. And then I'll tell her, I'll say, honey, well, you'll do this. No, I won't. Yes, you do. Example. I'm sitting down watching something. Marie doesn't watch much TV, but she'll come and sit next to me. And it'll be, 11 o'clock or whatever, and I'm watching the news. And she'll start nodding out. Inevitably. Her eyes, I'll just turn and I'll look at her, and her eyes are just starting to close. And I'll say to her, you're going to sleep. Why don't you go to bed? I'm not going to sleep. Yes, you are, honey. You're going to sleep. I'm not. I'm watching this. Really? You're watching this? Oh, okay, honey. And I keep watching. And I turn around. Honey, your mouth is open. Why don't you go to bed? I'm watching this. What did he say just now? He said this. Well, that's something he said 2 minutes ago just before you fell asleep. You ought to I don't want to go to bed because I'm sleepy. I mean, they do that. And I'm watching, and I watch her carefully. And I have an intense scrutiny. Yesterday, I was watching a basketball game. UCLA was playing Cal. Great game at the very end. At the very end, with like 1.5 seconds, some of you may have seen it or watched the news, there's scramble for the ball, and Ship takes this shot, and he sinks this amazing shot, and the Bruins go up by 1 point. And I was standing with a phone in my hand. My son David, who lives in an apartment in Chino, had called me because he's watching the game, and he had paused the game, but I'm watching it live. And so he said, Dad, are you watching the game? And I said, yeah. I was 3 feet from the screen, and I was standing right on top of it. And then the ball goes in, and I go, ah! I start to yell, and he goes, Dad, I've got this paused. What happened? What happened? I said, we just, wow, I can't believe this. I'm screaming. Now, what would have happened if Marie would have walked in and turned that TV off? I'd be talking about my deceased wife at this point. No, that's not smart. You don't do that. Because I concentrate. I will watch something closely, and I have done that with my wife all these years. And that's what he's saying. He's saying, your husbands watch you, ladies. And so they ought to see 2 things. One, they ought to see your chaste behavior. That word chaste speaks of the purity of your life, your modesty. They ought to see that you are pure from every fault, literally. They need to see the way that you live. Why? Because as they watch the way that you live, they grow deeper in love with you. They trust you. It's interesting how in Proverbs 31 verse 10 and 11, the writer said, who can find a virtuous wife? Her worth is far above rubies. The heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. Who can find a virtuous wife? Because her husband doth safely trust in her. And then when you've got a wife that has a purity about her, you trust her with everything in your life. Everything in your life. When you start dating and you start to trust, most men, not all, most men eventually begin to open up. I did. And I began to talk about my dreams. I talk about my hopes. I talk about my life. I've driven her through the neighborhood I grew up in, and I'll point out landmarks. So, they used to be a hedge there, and 2 guys beat me up behind that one time. And that place there, I can remember this, and that place there, I remember that. And I tell her my stories. I've been telling her stories about my life since we met, basically. And we've done this, and I've done that. She's heard it all. She knows everything that I'm willing to tell any human being. She has heard it all. She's heard the stories of joy, and she's heard the stories of pain. She's heard the stories of victory, and she's heard the stories of failure. She's heard them all. And she's been with me for so many years. And she's seen me when I've come in from something that's been tough or a struggle, or I've gotten bad news or whatever. She's been there with me through so much. How can I not help but trust her? Especially because she's a virtuous woman. Because my heart can safely trust in this woman. Because she has this chasteness. She has this purity about her. She has this thing that makes me trust her. You see, because Marie, if she wanted, has enough ammunition to hurt me at any given moment. All she has to do is find that spot that she knows is a weakness and use it for her own gain. And she could destroy me. She could write a book on the David you don't know and undermine everything about me. She could, and I know that because she knows my life the way it really is. When the anointing's on and when the anointing's not on. She knows me. And that's the way it is. She has my weaknesses and she has my strengths. And I have learned to trust her with both. Many years ago, 20-some years ago now, I was doing some marital counseling, young couple having difficulty in their marriage. I knew the young man and I knew the young woman. I had conducted their marriage for them. Now they're having problems in their marriage. And as they were seated before me, the young woman turned, looked at her husband, and then looked back at me and said something like, I don't know, maybe I should just divorce him. And then she looks right at her husband, right after saying that. I don't know, maybe I should just divorce him. Bang, she looks at him. This is a good-sized guy. He was 6'4", good-sized guy. He instantly crumbled in the seat. Instantly. He threw his hands on his face, and his shoulders went down, and he began to sob right in front of me. Now, I knew him, and I'd known him since he was 17 years old. I knew that he had a broken heart because his mom and his dad had divorced, and it was something that he, as a young boy, had never gotten over. It was the greatest fear of his life that the woman he loved would leave him someday, would divorce him. And she knew that, and she intentionally, in that office, looking in his face, said, maybe I should just divorce him. And I watched her as she looked right at him just to get the smile in her face. I'll never forget that, when she saw this man just break right in front of her and start to weep. That's the power you women have in our lives.